the DEI for Barclays in Asia. I'm also one of the DEI council members for NASSCOM. I feel privileged to be the session moderator today for this very interesting and important topic of human leadership. Most organizations today are increasingly becoming aware of the need to have a diverse workforce, and for the diverse workforce to thrive, inclusion and equity needs to coexist alongside diversity. If there's one thing that the COVID pandemic has taught us, is the need to focus on people first, the need to focus on well-being, and build everything around the human needs. So as we move towards a post-pandemic era, we need to take those lessons learned and not get back to the old ways that may not have really served us well, right? So, and organizations can build policies and processes, but translating them into the action is in the hands of the people leaders, right? They are the ones who need to put the person in the center and make those right decisions that serve both the individual and the organization. So it is at such touch points and other high level decision zones where human being first philosophy plays a very, very crucial role. Another important reason why we need to focus more on this human-centered leadership is how the millennial generation, who would soon form a very big part of the workforce, and the Gen Z, who are beginning to enter the workforce in big numbers, look at this aspect. They give importance to mental health, would prefer that the employers support diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. They are more aware of the social justice and the environmental movements. And if organizations miss to shift the thinking around inclusion, it would be very difficult to engage and leverage the goodness that this generation will bring. Well, there are many other lenses through which this topic would be looked at. And to explore further on this topic on human leadership, I'm delighted to welcome Alexis Zahner, founder and facilitator of Human Leaders, to share her thoughts with us. Alexis, I was just going through your profile, and I would really like to read it for those who have not caught up with that from your side. So Alexis says that it is through her experience of management, the good, bad, and the ugly, that her passion to bring more conscious, mindful, and human-centric approach to leadership was born. Her experience spans across local government, marketing, media consultancy, right through management at global brand Patagonia, working and living in multiple countries around the world. I think she has traveled around 40 countries, which is fabulous, Alexis. She beautifully articulates that through her professional experience and hobbies. She has learned that her core values are adventure, continuous learning, collaboration, truth-seeking, being of service, and gratitude. She's a keen surfer and a snowboarder who spends most of her spare time outdoors and connecting with nature and human beings. She is master's in business psychology and is also a mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy practitioner. Wonderful profile there, Alexis. So welcome to the session, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Chitra. It's a beautiful introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the broader community for having me here today. As Chitra has explained, I have quite a varied background. I do currently live in Australia. I've been very, very privileged to spend a good part of my career living in Canada as well. And I also spent a period of time living in Japan. So I have a bit of an understanding of what it feels like as a woman to travel, as a woman to work in different cultures, and also across different job functions within different organizations where that sort of cultural context can shift as well. So my work now is really in what we call human leadership. And we work essentially in leadership development within our framework of human leaders. So I'm going to pop some slides on now, and what I'm going to do is have a fairly brief presentation this morning for you around DEI and how DEI can be underpinned by human leadership. And from there, we'll be having a bit of a conversation, a bit of a panel conversation after that, where you'll be most welcome to ask questions, share your insights, and through the presentation as well. If you do have any insights, any questions, feel free to pop those into the chat and we will get to them as we move through the presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen and pop my slides on. Whoops, I've got the wrong slide sharing. Bear with me a second. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Yeah, it's visible, Alex. Please go ahead.
Perfect, thank you. So today we're going to be having a conversation around DEI and effectively what it takes to really achieve DEI in an organization, looking at what is within our power as leaders. So let's dive straight in. Now, DEI is a really, really challenging problem that many organizations face. It's increasingly becoming a prevalent conversation for organizations right now, but there's a few questions around why. And I think it's a really good place to start sometimes by asking ourselves these questions. Why are we trying to, or why are we pursuing DEI goals, and why are they so hard for us to achieve? Now, one of the number one things here that is a really big challenge around DEI goals is that first and foremost, the leaders driving the DEI change, so each and every one of us in our organization, isn't actually shifting or changing our mindset or behavior around the change that we're actually trying to implement. Now, it's really important here as leaders that we need to be able to walk and talk and exemplify the change that it is we wish to see in our organizations. And if our leadership isn't modeling this, our DEI initiatives simply will fall flat on their face. Now, one of the second issues here is around the structures that actually uphold issues like oppression and actually keep certain groups, certain minorities from actually feeling included in organizations. So there is a lot to unpack here, but effectively what we need to look at is really unpacking those structures that we have in place, those legacy structures that we have in place that are prohibiting us from moving towards our DEI goals. Now, to do this, we really need to better understand the groups that are most impacted by these structures. And by not hearing from them, we're simply not able to drive change forward in a way that's truly meaningful to them. So mostly this includes raising the voices of those who probably haven't been benefited from those structures. Now, lastly, here is how we actually measure success or our DEI goals and what we're actually measuring and if it's actually contributing in a meaningful way. Now, typically here, there's a lot of dialogue around numbers, people of diverse backgrounds sitting in executive positions, being on boards within your employee, whatever it may be. However, whilst having higher numbers, perhaps of whether it's of women on boards or people of diverse background in your organization, whilst numbers in and of themselves are fantastic change, if these are the only things that we're measuring, we're not really getting a true picture of whether or not we're creating the right environment, the right culture for diversity, equity, and inclusion to truly be imbued in our organization. Now, this includes things like psychological safety, leadership behavior, trust, empathy, all the things that have to happen, that have to be part of that culture to actually allow DEI to really be a part of our organization. Now, it's really important here to remember that inclusion and assimilation are very, very different things. So whilst we may have a diverse workforce, if they're not truly feeling included and able to contribute to their capacity, it's not really moving us towards those DEI objectives. And we're not really getting the best out of our people either. So really quickly here, to look at perhaps where we might be going wrong and where change needs to happen is we kind of need to take a really brief understanding or a brief look here at what change is all about and how does change work. So first and foremost, one of the biggest barriers, as I've mentioned, to change in organizations and DEI initiatives actually being imbued at all levels is that for whatever reason, the leader perhaps doesn't really value DEI. Now, this doesn't mean they might not be on board with carrying out the objectives of a DEI plan or whatever it is, but if they, to their core, don't feel the value of what it is to be included and to have a diverse team, they're not really going to move it forward in a way that is, visionary and is able to be taken on by their team. So first and foremost, this value, is DEI really imbued in your organizational values, actually? And does this come through in leadership behaviors? How do you communicate around DEI? Is this a value in the working arrangements that you have in your workplace? How is reward and acknowledgement given around DEI? And is DEI imbued in how you recruit and how you hire? Often in organizations, we talk about things like high performance, and we're really good at measuring and recognizing high performance. So if you're really saying that DEI is of value in your organization, how are you walking and talking this? And next in line with this is this actually compelling? Has your organization presented, and again, does it walk and talk a compelling vision for what DEI looks like in your organization? Does the leadership team actually understand and truly value DEI? And is everyone feeling compelled towards creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive work environment? Next, within this change piece of DEI is around planning. And again, I know most of you in this room here are in the DEI space, but often we see things like workshops around DEI. We see very face level, surface level conversations happening around DEI. When we're serious about DEI, we have to actually plan to understand first and foremost what needs to change and why, but then also the how. How are we going to go about this? What are the metrics? What are the measures in place? This has to be transparent. This has to be quantifiable, and it has to be very, very deliberate. And this feeds straight back into that compelling vision of DEI change. Now, in any change, the things that we want to start with are the things that we actually have control over. So when it comes to DEI as leaders, first and foremost, our control lies in how we choose to show up every day. That is directly within our capacity to change right now. So looking at things like our own mindset, our own personal interest, and our investment in actually growing a culture and shifting a culture towards one that does have more diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not until we ourselves are able to model this behavior that we can then focus on what we have influence over, and that is others. So there's a classic saying that we have in Australia that many of us probably have heard from our parents as children, and that is, don't do what I say. Sorry, don't do what I do what I say. So many of us here in Australia get told that as children, and it's a really frustrating thing to hear from your parents. And basically what it demonstrates is, I'm not role modeling the behavior I expect from you. I expect better from you, but I'm going to allow myself to behave in this way. So as leaders, if we aren't walking the walk, if we aren't talking the talk, how can we expect to influence others in this positive direction? So it's really important here that we understand that we do have influence over others just in how we behave. And we really need to ensure that our behavior aligns with this. So lastly here, measuring change. And I mentioned this really briefly in our previous slide, but we have to be conscious of what we're measuring and why. And we have to be holding ourselves fully accountable to this. In the same way you would hold your team accountable to sales objectives, project deadlines, we have to be holding ourselves accountability to our DEI objectives. And another reason why this is so critical is, if we don't hold ourselves accountable, the message that this sends to the members of our team and our employees is that we don't value DEI. So there are numerous reasons why we need to make this change measurable, but there are just a few to really think about here. So what the focus of today is really going to be on, and where my area of expertise really lies, is how we can begin with ourselves. And our work at Human Leaders is around helping leaders to become the best version of themselves that are truly capable of connecting with other human beings on that very foundational level. So where do we begin then as leaders? When it comes to DEI, when it comes to any change, we have to start with ourselves. It's what's immediately within our control. It's what we have the most power over changing, and it's how we actually gain our influence over others. So when it comes to DEI, we're looking at becoming aware of how we play into either the issues, but also the part that we can play in the solutions. It's looking at our behaviors and whether they reinforce and detract from our DEI goals, and where we need to shift and evolve. It's looking at our mindset and whether or not we're actually approaching DEI with the mindset that it requires. So things like non-judgment, open-mindedness, perhaps keeping our ego in check and being conscious of areas where we might need to bring a beginner's mind for the first time. And another concept here is looking at our communication and whether or not the way that we're communicating with those around us is, again, reinforcing the narratives that already exist, or is looking to evolve and create new ones. Now, just to preface this, change is really, really uncomfortable. Anyone who has ever been on a diet or has tried to exercise and get themselves to the gym regularly, you'll know just how hard it is to keep up routine. But even when we're feeling the frustration, the discomfort, and perhaps even the fear of change, it's not until we encroach this area and stay there and experience this in ourselves can we really actually start to realize some of the areas of our behavior, of our communication, of our mindset that are keeping us stuck right where we are and aren't moving us towards the DEI goals that we're chasing. So this is an equation from Simon Sinek, and he says that your values plus your behavior times by your consistency equals your leadership. So really what he's saying here is that you are what you repeatedly do. And the reason I wanted to include this was just really as a thought piece, as leaders, to reflect again, is what you're consistently doing really underpinning and reinforcing a positive message around DEI? Or is it undermining and reinforcing a negative one and a culture that you don't want within your organization? It's a really important thing for us to consider because we are what we repeatedly do. We are what we reward. We are what we acknowledge. So if our organizations are reinforcing cultures that aren't inclusive, that aren't diverse, and that aren't equitable, we'll keep getting what we've always got. So let's dive into what human leadership is all about then. So it begins with us. It begins with our self-leadership. It begins with getting to know who we are and how we show up. It calls for us to really cultivate a deep understanding of self. This includes what we value, also our future vision of self and the kind of world that we want to be living in. It calls for us to understand our strengths and where our challenges lie. And in the scope of DEI, this is really a big piece of this is starting to understand what we don't know, starting to uncover things like biases. It also calls for us to do the work in ourselves, to really develop a level of emotional regulation. Now, this is both a very uncomfortable practice and a process of being able to witness ourselves and understand our emotional state and really take control of those emotions so that we can come from a place of empowered responsiveness rather than reactivity. So another piece of internal self-awareness is what we call the mastery of control. And that is where we really have an understanding and cognizance of what is within our control, what we may have influence over, and what we have no control over. And this is really important in the DEI sphere as well, because depending on our role and the level of influence we have within an organization, sometimes we find that the only thing we have control over is really how we show up and how we behave and how we treat others. Hopefully, or fortunately, if you are in a leadership role where you have a team and where you have influence over others, you have this beautiful opportunity to make even more impactful change. But understanding what lies within your control is really critical here. So this is the first core piece then of human leadership, self-leadership. It's not until we get a handle on and connect to who we are and how we choose to show up that we can truly have genuine, authentic, and impactful influence over others. And this comes into our second piece of human leadership, which is how we lead others. Now, to lead others through times of change really requires an ability to connect and inspire them, underpinned by a shared sense of purpose that's united by vision. And again, this comes back to this piece of, is DEI really a value at your organization? Do people feel this from the top down? Do they see it? Do they hear it regularly? Are they seeing this modeled by their leaders? Now, when the going gets tough, a human leader has the capacity to face challenge with composure, creating a dynamic of resilience and capacity to overcome obstacles. This is going to be huge in the DEI process because there is going to be a lot of discomfort at all levels of the organization. And when it comes to leading others, Our employees need to know that we are a rock and that we can withstand discomfort and we can go headlong into conflict and come through it with the right amount of trust and psychological safety still there at the other side. It's also our job as leaders to ensure that our team are equipped with everything they need to move through these uncomfortable and challenging scenarios as well. So helping them to work on things like their awareness and giving them feedback to ensure that they're headed in the right direction as well. So to really lead others requires a great deal of courageous honesty, and it also requires humility, because there are moments where as leaders, we will be learning and relearning with everyone else. So this might feel that, or it might seem pretty obvious that to not continue making the same mistakes again, we need to shift our behavior. But we see this so often in organizations that we work with at Human Leaders. People trying to implement the same things over and over again, or in themselves, not change their behavior that may be reinforcing negative cultures or toxic cultures in their organization. When it comes to leading others to truly cultivate connection, cultivate mindful communication, we have to stop and understand how others perceive us, and we have to be willing to change ourselves. So the last piece of our human leadership framework is what we call radical responsibility. This calls for us to hold ourselves accountable in every single situation. Now, an issue we see so frequently in the DEI space is what we call passing the buck. So we very often as consultants get brought into organizations to support with DEI initiatives. But what we often see is a disconnect between the reason why we've been brought in and, again, the true accountability from the leaders who are moving DEI initiatives forward. If we're serious about DEI within an organization, we have to hold ourselves accountable for the outcomes. We have to know that it's with us where the buck stops to move these initiatives forward. Now, in human leadership, our responsibility also extends beyond the workplace. We know that as human leaders, our own personal well-being is as critical outside of work as it is to our performance inside of work. So how we take care of ourselves, such as managing our stress, ensuring we have a sense of community and connectedness to human beings around us, things like sleep, nutrition, and exercise are all part of being able to show up as our best self. And this is also work that we do at Human Leaders to ensure that the leaders we work with have a very holistic and well-rounded approach to their leadership. The last piece of radical responsibility is evolution. And this is really the mindset piece that I've mentioned here. What evolution requires us to do, and in particular in a DEI space, is to be constantly thinking and rethinking our approach. We have to be open to change. We have to be open to making mistakes, and we have to be open to learning and iterating our approach at every step of the way. So this is a very quick overview, or a macro level overview, if you will, of what it means to be a human leader and what we work on in our human leadership development programs to actually imbue this in the leaders that we work with. So human leadership improves foundational behaviors that are actually needed for DEI. It's a precursor to good DEI outcomes. Why? Because if we're not changing, again, who and how and what we're showing up like in our organizations, we can't expect DEI initiatives to filter down. We also can't expect our leaders to truly feel connected to the DEI initiatives that they're driving in organizations. So human leadership improves our capacity to build things like psychological safety. Psychological safety is a critical precursor to DEI. Employees must feel safe to challenge the status quo. They must feel safe to speak up, and they must feel safe to come to work as themselves. Empathy is a critical piece in human leadership, especially when we're looking at the diversity spectrum here, because very often we're dealing with other employees and other human beings that have a very different lived experience from our own. So empathy calls for us to be able to develop the skills to shift perspective. We have to be able to understand, or at least resonate with, some of the lived experiences of others, some in which we will never experience ourselves. So empathy helps us to develop this. Trust is a critical piece in DEI, and open-mindedness and mindful communication. So there's some of the key ways that human leadership develops the foundational behaviors needed to drive DEI initiatives. It's a continuous feedback loop when it comes to developing DEI initiatives through human leadership. We develop ourselves, we overhaul the systems, we measure and we iterate our successes and our failures, and we keep this loop going. DEI isn't a one and done. It is something that we will continually be learning and evolving as we work. It also should be something that we continually try to bring in the knowledge of our employees and involve them in this process as well. This is critically important in overhauling the systems. If we don't raise the voices of those whom we're trying to support, we can't understand what they need. So our mindful communication piece of human leadership really gives us that skill to start having that dialogue around these sorts of issues. So developing ourselves, overhauling our systems, measuring the right things, not just bums in seats, measuring the right things: engagement, safety, trust, empathy, employee feedback on leadership, and then continuing that process over and over again. So I'll leave you with this quote, and that is that the greatest project that we'll ever undertake is working on ourselves. I implore you as leaders, you have a great deal of power to drive change in your organization. Please don't look without. Please don't look at the systems and the structures necessarily around you. Be willing to become the change that you need to see in your organization. That is where your greatest power is held. So thank you very much. I will leave you with a slide here around some more information around what we do at Human Leaders. In 2023, we're having our Human Leaders Certification Program, which is a 10-month immersive program from human learner to human leader. And we also have our Human Leaders online community where we host sessions and community gatherings every month. So thank you so much for being with me today. I hope that you've learned something new, and I'll pass back to Chitra for some conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was an excellent session. So many interesting points there. My mind is bubbling with a lot of questions. So let me first go with the change element that you spoke about. So can you share with us some of the examples on how some of your clients have implemented that change, and what was the outcome when they really adopted this model and implemented the change?
On an individual level, do you mean?
Yeah, it could be individual level or at organizational level.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess a great example that comes to mind, we did a project with a team here in Australia over a year ago now. They were within a hospital setting. So we did a series of workshops around the mindful communication piece of the human leadership framework. And interestingly, through the series of sessions, our mindful communication piece really includes things like nonviolent communication, listening skills, empathy building, and connection to other human beings. And we had a team of information professionals in a hospital setting, and they were having all sorts of sort of interteam, interpersonal conflict issues. So it has kind of shifted away from being around their job functions, and had sort of shifted into being a personal dynamic issue. And we did a series of our communication workshops, and what actually came out of that was so fascinating. It seemed so basic by the time we'd finished it, but so fascinating. And that was that the team didn't actually understand fully what each of them did as jobs. Now, I know that this seems from the outside quite perhaps a little crazy. How do you not know what your colleagues are doing? But because their team didn't have an open communication flow, there wasn't the psychological safety present for them to actually share some of their challenges and what they were actually up to on a day-to-day basis. When projects were getting held up, when documents couldn't be found, when different departments were asking them for things and people weren't responding in a timely manner. What we actually found is that there was basically a big misunderstanding happening around who was responsible for what, because they each didn't understand one another's role delineation. So through that series of workshops, we sort of drove some very honest and open dialogue around things like listening skills, around things like nonviolent communication. So asking questions in a way that I guess isn't inflammatory is the way to phrase that. So it's all about, the tone of asking questions. And we found that the team was able to bond in a really lovely way just by asking the right questions, really, and listening to one another. And we solved sort of most of their problems as being a big misunderstanding. But so often I think in the workplace, we get very caught up in what we should or shouldn't do, or what we can and what we can't do. And we just forget that we're dealing with other human beings, and something as simple as asking the right question and truly listening for the answer can actually fix a lot of problems. So I guess that's one example where in a team, simple changes around communication made all the difference.
That's an excellent example you see that shared with us. And I see some questions coming through the chat as well. I think there is one interesting one which I'm going to pick up first. So I think Zach from Wells Fargo says that the impact feels much more for someone in the same location. How do we make the same impact for a team that is spread globally? So you shared about certain in-person sessions. I think where Zach is coming from, how can you kind of, multiply that effect? Your thoughts on that, Alex?
Yeah, so my understanding, Zach, is your question around how you sort of manage a hybrid team and make sure everyone's saying they can contribute and their impact is the same. Is that the question? Yeah.
Yeah, looks like, yeah. Because
Okay,
when the person is talking about the global team, it cannot happen in person. It has to be hybrid. Yeah.
Fantastic. And that's a great question, Zach, because we've shifted so quickly in the past 2 years, haven't we, to global teams. My colleagues are the same. I've got a few colleagues in the US, a few in Canada, and a few in the Netherlands. So we're rarely in the same room with one another. And there's a few things to be conscious of here. So I think first and foremost, as a leader and as someone who's driving a global team, it's really important to become aware of some of your behaviors and perhaps some of the biases at play that may be a barrier to you treating teams fair. This is something we see so regularly in distributed teams, is as human beings, we naturally give precedence to those things closest to us. So if you're in the office space with another employee, you can develop a much better interpersonal relationship when you're seeing that person every day. You're perhaps having a glass of water at the same time over the water cooler, whatever it is. So something to just be conscious of is whether or not you are perhaps falling prey to that proximity bias. And a few things that you can do, I guess, to overcome that is really try and set up things like your meetings in a way where everyone can contribute. So small things like if you're in a distributed team and you have a Zoom call where part of your team's on Zoom, part of your team is in the room, it's really important how that's facilitated. It's really important how, as a leader, we're conscious of giving space to everyone's voice being able to contribute in those meetings, because again, we will give precedence to those closest to us. Looking at other ways that you can connect your remote team in, I guess, in an out of work context sometimes can bring people a little closer together. And at Human Leaders, we actually brought in some consultants earlier in the year to help us really understand this more as well. And some of their fantastic suggestions were around some kind of social online events where people can contribute and actually get to know one another a little bit more. Again, we miss so much of that now that we're in these distributed settings. So as a leader, I would probably say first and foremost, be very conscious of your time and energy and who's getting preference of that based on their proximity to you, because that proximity bias is a real thing. And it can really have employees feeling left out and not part of the group if they're feeling like because they're on Zoom, they're not getting your time. And also creating some of those opportunities for the team to come together and really engage with one another in a personal way, perhaps outside of work. And I guess that last one is just looking at how you're also hosting meetings when you do have a distributed team and making sure everyone's getting equal share of voice in that as well.
That's excellent. So I think, in sum, what I'm taking away is how do you kind of live those principles while you're connecting with the team in whichever mode, in person, or it could be hybrid. So that's the visible action, or we mentioned earlier in your session, how do you lead by that example and showcase that behavior in your every interaction, which kind of, sends this message home. Excellent. So while we're talking about it, I have another interesting question which follows in the same space. There is an attendee who's asking, how do you measure empathy at work, which takes into account the microaggressions? The assumption is that organizations have been sensitizing about DEI as an organizational values, and that things are in place as policies and guidelines. Maybe this person is coming from, while all this is in place, still these things continue. So how do you kind of measure that and help the organizations?
That is a really, really challenging thing. Empathy is one of those things that is less tangible. So it's more difficult for us to get a measure on. I think first and foremost, something to be conscious of when we speak about empathy is that there's a few different types of empathy. So there's cognitive empathy, there's also affective empathy. But what we're really looking for, what we are looking for at Human Leaders is what we call compassionate empathy. So it's where I understand this person's perspective, I feel their perspective, and I feel motivated to do something about it. Now, one of the quickest ways to annoy the heck out of your employees is to pretend like you care about their problems and do nothing about it. That faux empathy will get you nowhere. So as a leader, for me, and perhaps this could be a metric for measuring leaders in those situations, is, are you taking action from what you're seeing and hearing from your team? When they're coming to you with what matters most to them, are you feeling compelled to do something about it? Or are you sort of putting on a front that you care about what matters to them? And this comes back to that doing what we say we're going to do piece, walking the walk, because again, so often we speak about DEI initiatives in organizations and we don't take any action. And what we do then is really make employees who would benefit from DEI initiatives feel that we don't care about them. So another thing that we also do at Human Leaders, and we do this regularly within our team, is have a 360 feedback. So we actually ask our employees to provide feedback on their leader, but also beyond just metrics of, KPIs and do I feel like my job expectations clear? We ask questions like, do you feel cared about? Do you feel like your leader cares about you? Do you feel like you have enough time with your leader for conversation? These sorts of things. So again, it can be a little harder to measure, but typically I feel like a leader being respected by their employees is a pretty good metric around whether or not they're able to connect with them on that level of empathy required to really have an engaged team.
Excellent. I think you answered another question that we had on the similar topic, which is about how do you measure empathy? It seems to be so subjective. I think, you touched upon some of the points there very clearly as to look at what they're saying, what are they doing, how do you kind of follow up with the action and, put the list of actions that they are, that they've committed to doing. I think that would be a very interesting starting point.
Yeah.
So,
and I think I just want to touch on the microaggressions piece, because often the challenge here for those of us who come from a place of privilege is we don't know that we're committing microaggressions. So that's really where that 360 piece of feedback becomes really beneficial, because often as a leader, we're not getting feedback from our team. And that's actually part of the external self-awareness piece that we speak to at Human Leadership. We have to be open to getting feedback from others. And we also have to be comfortable in getting called out on those small microaggressions and behaviors. And if we have the right level of psychological safety present in our team, our employees hopefully feel comfortable enough to come and say things like, hey, I actually don't like the way that you spoke to me, or I don't like the way that this conversation went down in that meeting, or I felt this way. So that two-way dialogue is a pretty good measure of whether or not we're creating that psychological climate of safety for our employees as well.
I'm so sorry, there is a little lag in my connection. Yeah,
No
so I completely get where you're coming from on that point. So I'm going to similarly build on the same area. There is another interesting question that has come about on how do you counter perceptions of reverse bias among male colleagues. I think, Tara Pillai is asking, many of them seem to be perceiving DEI as a zero-sum game. So what is your response to that, Alex?
Yeah, it's a really challenging one. And I think the conversation around bias is really just one very small piece in the puzzle. I think when we put the focus purely on the interpersonal human element of DEI is when we will lose, because we are pitting people against one another. And that's where it's imperative to have a structural understanding of where DEI is actually, where the structure is still creating barriers to the DEI within your organization. The bottom line is, for many of us, we have privilege. That's just a thing. That's just how the world works. And there's no point in shaming or damning people for having privilege. And that's where I think it becomes a zero-sum game. And that's where I think sometimes when we have too much focus on issues like cognitive biases is when it becomes really problematic. It's certainly part of the puzzle, but DEI benefits everyone when we look at it in a structural way. And we have seen this in certain organizations who have done DEI well, if you could say that. But we do actually have happier employees. We do have better business outcomes as well, like more creativity. We actually have more productivity. We have more diversity of thought, more innovation as a result. So I think, I hope that answers the question, but I think it is very quickly a zero-sum game when we just focus on the cognitive bias and the sort of human behavior piece of it. When we remove that interpersonal nature and just look at the structures for what they are, is I think where we really get the most legs out of driving change.
Excellent. So we spoke about, perceptions and empathy, and, that's taking us to the next natural space of judgment. There is a question on that topic, I see. So there is Madan who's asking, I know the background of all my team members. How can I have a healthy conversation with them without judging them? That's very
it's a really critical, it's a great piece. And for me personally, this is where it comes down to the self-work. I as well, like many leaders in this room, have grown up with a certain set of experiences, a certain level of privilege, a certain level of affluence, whatever it may be. So a lot of the self-work for us at an individual level is really cultivating things like beginner's mind. I know for me personally, my path down mindfulness helped me to actually unpack a little bit of the perceptions that I was bringing to my conversations. So often witnessing our judgment is the first way in noticing we're coloring the conversations that we're having. So whether you're having a conversation with someone you totally disagree with, the opportunity to just witness the judgment that your brain's created in disagreement with them is sort of the first step, I guess, in unpacking that at an individual level. So I do think it takes a lot of self-work. It takes a lot of self-witnessing and a lot of internal self-awareness to really start consciously choosing to notice your judgment and just detach from your judgment in those moments. So it's not about whether your employee is right or wrong. Their experience is their experience. And actually, your judgment's actually irrelevant to their experience because it will still be what it is. So for me, the removing of judgment or the non-judgment in my life has really come more from a spiritual path and a mindfulness path. And I bring that into my leadership as well.
Excellent. So I think, we spoke about judgment, and then there is a natural segue on the feedback, which is Kamal is asking, how do you provide negative feedback to one of your strong members without hurting the person?
That's a really, really great question, Kamal. And I think first and foremost, there's no such thing as feedback. There's just feedback. There's feedback that can be delivered in a plethora of different ways. And one thing that we don't have any tolerance for in our organization is what we call brutal honesty. There's no need for honesty to be brutal. Honesty can always be kind and loving. So I think in terms of delivering negative feedback, I say what you're delivering is honest feedback. And I think feedback is actually very kind. And I think to give anyone feedback is coming from a place of love, because that's you wanting better for that person, and that's you wanting to give that person the information that you know will benefit them in moving forward. So I'd say when it comes to feedback, if you feel that it's going to be something that might be received in a negative way from the individual, it's really important to understand the tone and deliverance of the message, but also just to understand a little bit around sort of the language that you can use to deliver it in a constructive way. So, you know, we have marketing people within our organization that sometimes do things that maybe I don't agree with, or there are changes that need to be made. So you just need to take the personal element out of that and really look at how you can phrase that in a way that isn't going to be taken personally and is, you know, factual, but also gives the person opportunity to change. So we talk about feed forward very regularly. I'd never go to one of our marketing team and say, hi, your design was awful. I would go to them and say, you know, something like, I appreciate what you've done. What about if we were to try this, or could we also do it this way? So I don't think that feedback has to be negative. I think it can be constructive and forward moving if we deliver it in the right way.
Very, very true. I think, you know, it's important that it is shared. Right?
Yeah.
That's the underlying thing there, right? You know, just because it is difficult, one should not shy away. It's important to have that conversation.
Agreed.
And as we talk about,
yeah,
exactly. As we talk about this, I think I see another interesting question coming about on how do you apply this thinking to identifying the right leader for a job? Because there are often times when, you know, people have had that past experience where they show that, you know, they are fit enough to a particular opportunity, leadership opportunity, but when there are tough situations, they tend to not raise to the occasion, which leads to it not serving them as well as the organization. So how do you use this thinking to identify the right leaders for the right leadership position? I see a question on this.
Yeah, well, I would say as an organization, if your leaders aren't performing in certain areas, I'd say, what are you doing to support them in that? I think very often leaders get promoted for their technical skills and expertise, and they're not trained in these soft skills. We call them core competencies at Human Leadership. Things like communication and self-leadership are core competencies of leadership. But has your organization ever actually supported and developed your employees in those areas? Because these aren't things that there's a fallacy that some people are born leaders. That's absolutely not true. Some people are born extroverted and charismatic. However, that doesn't always make them a good leader. Leadership is a set of skills that can be developed and flexed where we need them. So I would say if your organization is having issues with your leaders underperforming in certain areas of their job, it's time to take some ownership for maybe developing them and looking at how you can support them to improve in the areas that you need them to as an organization.
Excellent. I think, you know, that there is a lot of talking about how do you build that inclusive leadership capabilities in our leaders. So I think everybody needs that help at some point in time. So it's important to understand that and extend that. And there is another interesting question. We spoke about leadership. There is something which is specifically on the neuro-inclusion. So an attendee is eager to understand how this human leadership approach would be relevant for neuro-inclusion in the workplace.
That's a great question. Neurodivergence is an increasingly important area in our DEI hiring. I can't speak to exactly the needs of folks with various neurodivergence requirements in the workplace, but again, what human leadership does is develop you as an individual to have the capacity to hold space for these differences, whether they are ethnic differences, cultural differences, religious differences, sexual orientation, or neurodivergence differences. When we become more comfortable and more grounded in ourselves through our leadership of self, our leadership of others, and our radical responsibility for self, we naturally become more open and conscious and cognizant of how we can hold space for others. And we become more willing, I think, to want to help other human beings and want to include other human beings very naturally. So a big piece of our human leadership development is really about self-compassion and developing our love for self, because when we do that, we can naturally then give that to other people. So I can't speak to exactly sort of how DEI initiatives around neurodivergence and neuroinclusion look in an organization, but on an individual level, when you develop yourself and your capacity to be a human leader, you will simply have better capacity and empathy to hold space for people different from yourself.
Absolutely well said, because the policies and processes don't help there. It's about how do you connect to another person as a human and understand the area where they come from and provide that support. And in neurodiverse space, it's not that one formula works, because every individual that comes is very, very unique. So how do you kind of fine tune your approach to reach out to them is this very crucial, and that's where having this human approach really helps.
So hi, this is Linika. I manage the DNI charter at NASCOM. So on the neuro inclusion, I'll give you a small example, right? So most of our job descriptions suggest that, the candidate must have good communication skills. Now, a neurodivergent might not want to apply for something like this because he's aware that does not have good communication skills, but does have collaboration skills. So it is also about sometimes how do you write your job descriptions. So as NASCOM, very soon we should be having a document on what neuro inclusion means in terms of how should you be communicating, what should the interview panel look like, how should our job descriptions look like, and we'll be very happy to share with this group here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lenika, for that. Yeah, one another question that occurred to me, Alexis, is that you spoke about the change starting with the self, right? In the model that in the framework that you shared. So is that space where we kind of bring in that unconscious bias awareness, and to help people to check and create the balance on how each of us carry. All of us are biased in some ways, right? So bias exists where brain exists. So how is that the zone where you bring in that awareness and then nudge people to be more aware of the biases that they carry and how it impacts them and their immediate ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're very right, Chitra, where the brain exists, bias exists. It's something that we don't get to choose. It's just something that's there, and it's something for us to increase our awareness of. So yes, we would focus on that in our internal self-awareness piece, which is one of the components of self-leadership. Now, something to be very, very conscious of here, and something that I see many organizations do very regularly, is use cognitive bias training as a be-all and end-all for DEI initiatives. Now, something to be very, very aware of here is that increasing your awareness of something does not increase your intention to act on it. So it's simply awareness increasing. If you don't choose to change your behavior as a result of your awareness increasing, you've simply learned something new about yourself and chosen not to act on it. So that's where I think the piece around developing, becoming the leader who's cognizant and conscious of what's going on and your biases is very, very important. But it's not until we integrate that with behavior change that we can actually drive these things forward. And that's why setting up processes and measuring and iterating is the two next steps that sort of flow on from that. So yeah, that's a great question. And we would tackle that in our internal self-awareness piece.
Fantastic. So I think you also touched upon there the intentionality to actual action gap that exists, because there is no leader today who says they are not supportive of DEI, but what do they really do about that thinking? Is where the real change happens. So I see the questions kind of slowing down. I think we have touched upon most of the questions that came about and some of the things that I had observed as a part of the session. So any final closing remarks from you, Alexis?
Closing remarks, the big thing for me that I would love to see leaders do is just really take ownership of this issue and look to close that intention versus action gap. Ask the right questions. Know that it is one thing to want DEI in your organization and a very different thing to take conscious steps towards it. So start with yourself, reflect, understand what you actually value and whether your behavior and your actions are reinforcing that. And if what you say you value and what you do are two different things, I think it's time for that reflection to really reset and move forward with intention around that. So we each have the power to go away and do that today as leaders. And then tomorrow we can look at how our behavior and our communication can reinforce and unpack the systems at play in our organizations as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing so many excellent insights on diversity, equity, inclusion, and how can that thinking be implemented into the leadership engagement that our leaders can have in the workplace. So I'm sure if there are any learning material or any references that you would like to pass on to this audience, please do share with us, Alex. We will definitely take it forward, because this is one area where it's not that we have done a session and it's over. It's like, how do you keep this conversation going, and how do you build that awareness more and more, and how do you kind of translate that into the actual action in everything that we do, both at the individual level, and how do we collectively influence that for the organizations that we are part of. It's more important. So we would really welcome anything that you would like to share with this group as any reading material or any references that they could dip into in future. So if you can share it with Lenika, we will request that she cascades that through the beautiful community portal that has been put together for the DEI at NASSCOM. So thank you so much for that excellent session, and thank you NASSCOM so much for bringing a beautiful speaker like Alex to us to share such wonderful insights. And we do look for more such engagements in the future, and to keep this conversation going. And thank you all participants for being such engaged audience, and for bringing up so many interesting and intriguing questions, which kind of helped us even expand our knowledge and thinking further on this space. So thank you all for your